January 1946. The winter wind cuts through the skeletal remains of German towns, carrying the scent of ash and damp stone. Streets, once alive with laughter, are now silent corridors of rubble. A lone chimney releases a thin plume of smoke from a partially standing house, its walls scarred by shell fire. Children wander in tattered coats, their eyes wide with hunger and uncertainty, clutching scraps of paper that might once have been homework. The familiar rhythm of school bells has long been silenced, replaced by the hollow echoes of war's aftermath. In the midst of this desolation, Allied soldiers arrive, not with weapons but with books, pencils, and a promise of education. They move carefully, aware of the children's hesitation, the shadows of distrust cast by years of indoctrination and fear. Some children glance at the soldiers, unsure whether to approach, while others stare silently at the makeshift classroom set against a ruined wall. A quiet tension fills the air, broken only by the soft scratch of pencil on paper. Here, among the ruins, learning begins again, tentatively, painfully, and with an emotion too deep for words. From these fragile beginnings, the story of hope and resilience unfolds. By January 1946, Germany lay in ruins. Cities that had once thrummed with life, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, were reduced to rubble, their streets choked with debris and the memories of destruction. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled by Allied bombing campaigns, while the front lines of war had left towns and villages scarred with shell craters, collapsed bridges, and shattered schools. The civilian population, exhausted from years of conflict, faced shortages of food, fuel, and shelter. Among the hardest hit were the youngest citizens, children, some orphaned, many displaced, and nearly all deprived of education for years. Before the war, Germany had maintained one of Europe's most structured educational systems. Primary education was mandatory, and schools provided literacy, basic numeracy, and cultural instruction. By 1945, however, this system had collapsed. Bombed-out school buildings, decimated teacher ranks, and the disruption of everyday life meant that millions of children had missed years of schooling. In some regions, particularly in urban centers, children as old as 12 could barely read or write. For Allied occupation forces, this posed a humanitarian challenge, as well as a societal risk. Illiterate populations were more vulnerable to instability, disease, and ideological manipulation. The Allied occupation, divided among the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, was not solely a military administration. Reconstruction included infrastructure repair, food distribution, and efforts to restore social services. Education became a priority for the Americans, who viewed literacy not only as a humanitarian mission, but as a crucial step toward democratization and stabilization. Military governors issued orders to rebuild schools, recruit teachers, and deliver educational materials. The initiative extended beyond cities to small towns and villages, often in areas that had seen prolonged frontline fighting. In January 1946, the U.S. Army Civil Affairs units were active across the American zone, identifying schools that could be repaired in communities where children were most in need. Supplies, books, notebooks, pencils, and chalk were scarce, and improvisation was essential. Soldiers themselves often became the first teachers, stepping into classrooms where walls were missing and desks had been burned or crushed. The role of these soldiers was as much psychological as educational. Their presence symbolized a new authority, one separate from the remnants of Nazi structures, yet their success depended on the children's trust. Local attitudes varied. In rural areas, some villagers welcomed the initiative, hoping it would bring a sense of normalcy to their children's lives. In other regions, decades of indoctrination under Nazi rule had instilled a deep skepticism toward outsiders, particularly occupying forces. Children, conditioned by years of propaganda, were cautious, often wary of adults in uniform. Yet curiosity was inevitable. Some came to classrooms carrying fragments of textbooks salvaged from destroyed schools, while others approached tentatively, guided by mothers or older siblings. The first weeks were slow, filled with silences, nervous glances, and tentative scribbles in pencil. Education, however, was more than a return to reading and writing. It was the beginning of psychological rehabilitation. Allied planners understood that literacy was linked to empowerment, confidence, and resilience. A child who could decode a simple sentence was reclaiming a piece of agency taken away by war. The earliest sessions were therefore carefully structured. Soldiers read aloud, demonstrating the sounds of letters and words. Children repeated syllables, copying shapes on torn scraps of paper. The room's temperature, often bitterly cold due to broken windows, did little to dampen the quiet determination that began to build. Small victories, a correctly written word, a child's first sentence, were celebrated with smiles, nods, and, sometimes, tears. This fragile progress set the stage for broader programs. Within weeks, larger groups of children gathered in temporary classrooms, and the U.S. Army worked with local volunteers to identify older children who had missed multiple years of schooling. These catch-up classes were intensive, demanding both patience and innovation. Soldiers adapted lessons, used games to teach letters, and incorporated real-world context to make reading meaningful. The overarching goal was to transform a generation scarred by war into a population capable of understanding and shaping a new Germany. The foundation was being laid. In broken towns and frozen fields, amid distrust and the remnants of war, literacy programs began to take root. The scene was modest. Makeshift classrooms, frost on windows, children with threadbare coats. But the significance was profound. In this environment, the story of hope, courage, and recovery would unfold, and it was here that the tears of German children first mingled with the soft strokes of a pencil. As winter deepened across Germany in early 1946, the scale of the educational crisis became increasingly apparent. Beyond destroyed buildings and absent teachers, the psychological scars of war presented another barrier. Children had witnessed violence, starvation, and the sudden disappearance of family members. Some had spent months, even years, in hiding or in refugee camps. Many carried an ingrained mistrust of authority figures, a product of Nazi indoctrination and the chaos of collapse. Allied educators and soldiers had to navigate not only logistical challenges, but also the fragile emotional state of their pupils. Civil affairs officers of the U.S. Army developed a systematic approach to rebuilding education. Temporary classrooms were established in community centers, churches, and even partially standing homes. Where furniture was destroyed, crates and benches served as desks. Teachers, often volunteers from nearby towns or members of the Army themselves, were trained to work with children at varying literacy levels. Materials were scarce. Paper and pencils had to be rationed, and books salvaged from bombed libraries or shipped from abroad. Every lesson was a small logistical triumph, a delicate orchestration of resources, time, and human patience. Language and pedagogy presented additional hurdles. Some children had been taught using pre-war curricula infused with Nazi ideology, which needed careful correction. Teachers and soldiers focused on fundamental literacy, letters, words, and simple sentences, while gradually introducing critical thinking and factual knowledge about the outside world. In many cases, reading exercises were tied to immediate survival. Instructions for ration distribution, basic hygiene, and safety were embedded in lessons, giving children both practical knowledge and renewed confidence. Community cooperation was essential. Parents were encouraged to allow children to attend classes despite the pressing demands of post-war survival. Mothers, often burdened with feeding large families, sometimes hesitated, fearing exposure to cold classrooms or strangers in uniform. Slowly, trust developed. Soldiers and teachers learned local names, remembered personal details, and treated mistakes with patience rather than punishment. These small gestures, seemingly mundane, were instrumental in bridging the gap between former enemies and establishing an environment conducive to learning. Resistance and tension persisted, particularly in regions with strong Nazi sympathies or lingering anti-Allied sentiment. Propaganda and rumors occasionally undermine trust, and some children initially refuse to participate. However, repeated exposure to consistent, supportive instruction began to break down these barriers. Reports from civil affairs units describe moments when children tentatively approached classrooms, encouraged by peers, and then gradually engaged in reading exercises. It was not a linear process. Progress was punctuated by setbacks, but every successful session reinforced the transformative potential of education. By spring 1946, these literacy programs had expanded beyond small experimental groups. Larger, more formal schools reopened under Allied supervision, some even staffed with returning pre-war German teachers who were vetted for their adherence to democratic principles. Soldiers who had taught in temporary classrooms were now involved in training local teachers, ensuring that literacy efforts would be sustainable. Curricula included basic arithmetic, reading comprehension, and writing, with careful attention to removing ideological distortions from prior education. The emphasis was on accuracy, comprehension, and fostering a sense of curiosity rather than rote memorization. The impact extended beyond individual children. Communities began to perceive Allied forces not solely as occupiers, but as facilitators of recovery. The presence of structured education introduced stability, routine, and predictability to lives disrupted by war. Children returned to daily schedules, learned to collaborate, and discovered the tangible rewards of knowledge. For many, these lessons represented the first taste of normalcy since the war's end. The process, slow and painstaking, sowed the seeds for the reconstruction of German society itself. By mid-1946, preliminary reports indicated measurable progress. Literacy levels in targeted communities improved significantly, and children who had once struggled to write their own names were now reading aloud in groups. Observers noted tears in classrooms, not from fear or hunger, but from the overwhelming realization of achievement. The sight of a child reading a simple sentence, guided by a soldier or teacher, became emblematic of hope, resilience, and the human capacity to recover. These moments foreshadowed the larger narrative of post-war Germany, a nation learning to rebuild not only its cities, but the minds and hearts of its next generation. The stage was now set to explore these programs from multiple angles. The human stories, the logistical ingenuity, the leadership decisions, and the moral implications of restoring literacy in a nation emerging from total war. The most immediate and compelling perspective in the post-war literacy campaign was the human one. Children, many of whom had never known a life outside of fear and scarcity, approached education with a mix of curiosity, hesitation, and raw emotion. Observers described small groups of boys and girls huddled around soldiers who knelt at their level, guiding trembling hands to form letters on scraps of paper. Tears were frequent, not from discipline or punishment, but from the sheer intensity of discovery. A child who had struggled to recognize a single letter could suddenly read a complete word, and the resulting pride and relief were palpable. Parents, too, were transformed by these efforts. Mothers watched cautiously from the doorways of improvised classrooms, often clutching younger siblings or household belongings, unsure whether to trust the uniformed strangers teaching their children. Over time, as they saw progress and patience, many parents began to participate in the process, helping with homework or bringing additional children to lessons. The act of literacy became communal, a shared triumph bridging the divide between former enemies. Teachers and soldiers alike reported a quiet sense of responsibility. Many had not anticipated the emotional intensity of teaching war-affected children, who were both cautious and extraordinarily perceptive. Each small success, every neatly formed word, every sentence read aloud, was a reminder that education was as much about restoring humanity as it was about technical literacy. These human moments laid the foundation for trust and resilience, turning classrooms into sanctuaries amid devastation. The logistical planning behind these literacy programs was surprisingly complex, given the post-war conditions. Civil affairs officers had to identify communities with the greatest need, often navigating destroyed roads, minefields, and unstable bridges. Temporary classrooms were selected based on structural stability and accessibility, with a preference for buildings that could withstand the cold months and protect materials from theft or damage. Some schools were established in partially standing structures, others in churches, town halls, or makeshift tents. Supply chains were equally challenging. Paper, pencils, chalk, and books were limited commodities, often requiring coordination between military depots and international aid agencies. Soldiers created inventories, rationed materials, and improvised substitutes where necessary. Broken crates became desks. Newspapers served as worksheets, and blackboards were salvaged from abandoned schools. Transportation of these resources often relied on military vehicles diverted from traditional duties, illustrating a deliberate commitment to education as a strategic priority. Planning also accounted for the varying levels of literacy among children. Class sizes were small, and students were grouped by ability rather than age, ensuring that lessons were neither too easy nor too overwhelming. Soldiers and teachers coordinated lesson schedules, rotated instructors, and incorporated practical exercises into daily routines. The tactical effort was not merely administrative. It required constant problem-solving, adaptation to local conditions, and sensitivity to human behavior under extreme stress. Technology, in the form of materials and tools, played an essential role in these literacy initiatives, even if it was rudimentary. In many communities, the destruction of printing presses and libraries left a scarcity of textbooks. American military supply chains supplemented local efforts with printed primers, illustrated storybooks, and basic arithmetic workbooks. Where official materials were lacking, soldiers improvised. Cardboard was transformed into flashcards, pieces of wood and chalk into portable writing slates. Innovative use of existing resources extended to the physical environment. Lessons were conducted outdoors during mild weather, with large letters painted on walls or chalked on sidewalks. Community centers often became multipurpose classrooms, with space partitioned using crates or fabric. Visual aids, such as simple diagrams of everyday objects, helped children associate words with real-life references. Even the smallest resource, a tin can, a scrap of paper, was leveraged to maintain engagement and reinforce learning. This resourcefulness was a crucial factor in overcoming material scarcity and maintaining consistency in instruction. Soldiers and teachers learned to view limitations not as obstacles, but as opportunities for creativity. The ability to teach effectively with minimal resources reflected both logistical acumen and an understanding of the psychological needs of children who had grown up in a landscape of deprivation. The success of post-war literacy programs depended heavily on effective leadership within the Allied occupation. Decisions were made at multiple levels, from high-ranking civil affairs officers to the soldiers on the ground. Commanders understood that restoring education was not merely a humanitarian gesture, but a strategic necessity for stabilizing the American zone. Orders emphasized patience, consistency, and the protection of children from both physical and psychological harm. Leaders coordinated logistics, ensuring that supplies reached even remote villages. They liaised with local authorities and vetted teachers to maintain a balance between restoring German autonomy and preventing the resurgence of extremist ideologies. Soldiers and officers were encouraged to act as facilitators rather than enforcers, fostering an atmosphere of cooperation. The result was a layered chain of command that combined operational efficiency with sensitivity to the cultural and emotional context of post-war Germany. Leadership also meant innovation and training. Many soldiers lacked formal teaching experience, so officers implemented on-the-job guidance, pairing experienced educators with military personnel. These mentoring relationships allowed soldiers to learn pedagogical techniques while maintaining military discipline and order. The emphasis on adaptive leadership, responding to challenges in real time, proved critical, as each classroom presented unique obstacles in terms of student readiness, resource availability, and local sentiment. Despite the humanitarian focus, the legacy of war and Nazi influence created pockets of resistance among both adults and children. Propaganda had fostered suspicion of outsiders, particularly the occupying forces. Some children initially refused to participate, while certain parents discouraged attendance, fearing ideological contamination or reprisal from former Nazi sympathizers. These attitudes added a layer of complexity to the literacy mission. Soldiers and teachers quickly learned to navigate these tensions. Trust building became as important as instruction. Approaches included small group sessions to reduce intimidation, personalized attention to recognize each child's name and abilities, and consistent demonstration of reliability over weeks and months. Occasionally, local volunteers who had remained neutral during the war were recruited to serve as intermediaries, bridging cultural gaps and reinforcing the legitimacy of the educational efforts. Resistance also manifested in practical challenges. Books and supplies were sometimes destroyed or hidden, classrooms were sabotaged, and rumors circulated to discredit Allied initiatives. Yet these obstacles often produced innovative solutions. Makeshift storage areas were established, lesson plans adapted to irregular attendance, and soldiers became adept at negotiation and persuasion. Over time, initial resistance gave way to cautious acceptance, and even skepticism transformed into engagement as children began to experience the tangible benefits of learning. At its core, the post-war literacy campaign carried profound moral significance. Teaching children to read and write went beyond practical knowledge. It was a reclamation of agency, dignity, and hope in the aftermath of mass destruction. Education became a tool to counteract the psychological trauma of war, empowering children to participate in society and envision a future beyond survival. Philosophically, these efforts reflected a broader Allied commitment to Reconstruction as an ethical imperative. Restoring literacy was a deliberate assertion that humanity could endure even after the atrocities of total war. Each lesson represented a small but meaningful act of restoration. A child mastering a sentence, a community regaining routine, a society reclaiming cultural continuity. Observers noted that tears in classrooms were not solely expressions of frustration. They were often the manifestation of relief, pride, and the dawning recognition of possibility. Furthermore, the moral dimension extended to the soldiers and educators themselves. Witnessing children overcome fear, hesitation, and deprivation fostered empathy and reinforced the value of patience, persistence, and human connection. Literacy became a conduit for healing on both sides, offering children a chance at knowledge and normalcy, while allowing occupying forces to engage in an ethical exercise of care and responsibility. This moral and philosophical perspective underscored a critical truth. Post-war recovery was not only about physical reconstruction, but about nurturing minds and spirits. Literacy programs symbolize the intersection of humanitarian action, strategic foresight, and ethical responsibility, revealing that education could serve as a bridge from devastation to renewal. Spring 1946 brought a subtle but powerful shift in the occupied German towns. The bitter winds of winter had eased, allowing classrooms to expand outdoors and in larger buildings. Small clusters of children, once hesitant and withdrawn, now arrived with notebooks tucked under threadbare coats. They gathered around blackboards and makeshift desks, their eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, curiosity, and anticipation. It was in these fragile moments that the first breakthroughs in literacy occurred, a turning point in a story that had been defined by scarcity and uncertainty. One such classroom was established in a partially standing school in a small town near Hanover. The building's roof had been partially destroyed, and the walls were pockmarked with shrapnel. Despite the conditions, Sergeant James Howard, a former clerk turned volunteer teacher, knelt beside a group of children, patiently guiding their fingers across letters traced in chalk. For weeks, progress had been slow, Some children could barely recognize vowels, while others struggled to form basic words. On this morning, however, a quiet excitement began to ripple through the room. A young boy, barely 9, successfully read aloud a sentence from a salvaged primer. The sun rises over the town. The reaction was immediate and profound. Tears welled in the boy's eyes, and the other children stared, some whispering translations to their peers, others copying the words onto their own slates. Sergeant Howard, suppressing his own emotion, recognized the magnitude of the moment. This was more than reading. It was reclamation, proof that these children could, against all odds, rebuild a piece of their lives and their minds. Across the town, similar moments unfolded. Girls and boys who had once roamed the streets aimlessly began to articulate words, form sentences, and slowly regain confidence in their abilities. The turning point was not purely emotional. It was reinforced by structure and persistence. Soldiers and teachers implemented sequential lessons, carefully tracking each child's progress. Worksheets were modified to address individual challenges, and small reading groups allowed children to support one another. By mid-April, reports from civil affairs units indicated measurable improvements. Literacy rates in targeted classrooms had risen dramatically over the prior months, and children who had initially refused to participate were now among the most eager learners. These breakthroughs demonstrated the effectiveness of combining patience, repetition, and tangible support, a formula that would define the program's success. The emotional impact was further amplified by parental engagement. Mothers and fathers who had watched cautiously from doorways began to witness their children reading and writing for the first time in years. Some could hardly conceal their tears, overwhelmed by pride and relief. In one notable instance, a mother, having observed her son write his name independently, whispered to a neighbor, "He is no longer lost. He is finding his way again." These moments reinforced the broader social significance of the literacy campaign. It was restoring not only individual skills, but community cohesion and hope. Simultaneously, soldiers and teachers faced the critical challenge of sustaining momentum. Attendance remained inconsistent in some areas due to illness, lingering distrust, or harsh weather conditions. Yet the first breakthroughs created a contagious sense of possibility. Children began encouraging one another, forming study pairs, and celebrating small achievements with quiet gestures of pride. A completed page, a correctly read sentence, a neatly formed letter. The momentum of these cumulative successes transformed classrooms from mere instructional spaces into arenas of emotional resilience. By late spring, these tangible results converged into a symbolic climax. In Hanover, a makeshift auditorium hosted a reading session for nearly 50 children. Each child took turns reading aloud from salvaged books, while soldiers and local volunteers observed. The room, illuminated by slivers of sunlight through shattered windows, echoed with words that had been silenced for years. For many, the act of reading aloud for the first time in a structured setting was overwhelming. Tears were common, and laughter followed. Emotional responses intertwined, signaling not only intellectual achievement, but psychological recovery. This turning point revealed a crucial truth. Education in post-war Germany was inseparable from human emotion. Literacy was not just a skill. It was a conduit for hope, trust, and renewal. In these moments, the children's tears, once born of fear and uncertainty, transformed into expressions of triumph and connection. The meticulous planning, logistical ingenuity, and human compassion that had preceded these breakthroughs culminated here, marking the first tangible victory in a long road toward restoration. The scene was set for the continuation of this emotional and educational journey. From these classrooms, lessons would spread to surrounding villages, influencing larger communities and solidifying the transformative power of literacy in post-war recovery. Following the initial breakthroughs in towns like Hanover, the post-war literacy campaign began to expand across the American-occupied zone of Germany. What had started as small, experimental classrooms became a coordinated effort to reach hundreds of villages, many of which had been entirely cut off from education for years. Soldiers and teachers carried with them not only supplies, books, pencils, paper, but also the methodology refined through weeks of trial, patience, and observation. Each new classroom represented a microcosm of the broader mission, restoring normalcy and confidence to children whose lives have been defined by chaos. One significant milestone occurred in Göttingen, where a previously abandoned schoolhouse was repaired with the help of local volunteers and U.S. Army engineers. Within its walls, 60 children, ranging in age from 7 to 14, began lessons organized by literacy level rather than age. Teachers had learned that grouping children this way minimized frustration and maximized learning potential. In this classroom, the impact was immediate. Hesitant whispers became confident readings, broken sentences became coherent thoughts, and timid gestures of participation were met with encouragement and smiles. The cumulative effect was palpable. The children's progress created a ripple of enthusiasm that spread to neighboring communities. Soldiers who had been reluctant instructors initially discovered their own capacity for empathy and patience. Sergeant Howard, now overseeing multiple classrooms, described a defining moment when a group of 10-year-olds read aloud together for the first time. "I saw them look at each other with pride," he later recalled. And in that instant, it wasn't just reading, it was a reclaiming of their childhood. Across dozens of classrooms, similar scenes unfolded. Children's eyes brightened, parents watched with astonishment, and the rigid barriers between occupiers and civilians softened through shared accomplishment. The expansion of literacy efforts also involved adapting to logistical and cultural challenges. Some villages lacked any suitable buildings, requiring lessons to be held in barns, churches, or even open courtyards during mild weather. Materials were recycled creatively. Scraps of cardboard became slates. Sections of newspaper served as practice pages, and rudimentary illustrations helped convey meaning where words alone could not. In regions where parents remained skeptical, soldiers conducted community meetings to explain the program, emphasize its safety, and demonstrate tangible benefits. Slowly, these efforts overcame lingering resistance, building trust one interaction at a time. By summer 1946, the cumulative effect of these programs became undeniable. Civil affairs reports noted dramatic improvements. Children who had arrived unable to identify letters were reading complete paragraphs. Older students who had missed years of schooling could now perform arithmetic and engage in simple writing exercises. Teachers observed not only cognitive gains, but also emotional growth. Children laughed together while practicing new words, shared discoveries with siblings, and displayed pride in their achievements. These reactions, long absent in war-torn communities, reflected both the effectiveness of instruction and the healing power of structured, supportive environments. A particularly striking example came from a rural village near Kassel. Soldiers established a temporary classroom in a partially standing barn. Among the students was a boy of 12 who had spent the previous 2 years scavenging for food and avoiding bombing zones. Initially silent and withdrawn, he gradually began copying letters, then words, and finally short sentences. On the day he read aloud his first paragraph, a simple story about a sunrise, he wept openly. His tears were not of sadness, but of relief and triumph. Witnessing this transformation, the soldier assigned to him realized that literacy had restored a measure of agency and dignity that the war had stripped away. Across the occupied zone, thousands of children experienced similar moments, each a testament to resilience and determination. These collective breakthroughs represented more than educational achievement. They symbolized a turning point in the psychological and social recovery of post-war Germany. Children who had once been lost in streets of rubble were now engaged in structured learning, building confidence and reclaiming parts of childhood stolen by conflict. Soldiers and educators saw firsthand the transformative power of sustained effort, patience, and human connection. The initial victories in isolated classrooms had evolved into a movement that reshaped communities, inspired trust, and laid the foundation for the broader reconstruction of German society. By the end of summer 1946, literacy programs had become emblematic of post-war recovery. The emotional intensity of early breakthroughs, the tears, laughter, and quiet pride of children, remained central to the narrative, reinforcing the moral and social significance of education. What had begun as a small, fragile experiment had matured into a decisive turning point. Evidence that even in the aftermath of total war, hope, knowledge, and human resilience could triumph. The successful implementation of these programs naturally led to long-term consequences, both immediate and far-reaching. Communities began to stabilize, children gained confidence, and Allied forces observed measurable improvements in social cohesion and trust. These developments set the stage for examining the aftermath, the broader societal impact, statistical outcomes, and enduring legacies of this post-war educational effort. By the close of 1946, the effects of post-war literacy programs were beginning to manifest in tangible, measurable ways. Allied Civil Affairs reports highlighted significant increases in reading and writing proficiency among children across the American-occupied zone. In towns where literacy programs have been active for 6 months or longer, children who had once struggled to identify letters were now reading simple paragraphs aloud. Older children, previously denied schooling for years, had mastered basic arithmetic and were composing short essays. The results were not only educational. They reflected a broader reconstruction of community and trust. Communities themselves began to transform. Where classrooms had been silent and hesitant, they now thrived with energy and curiosity. Parents, initially cautious or skeptical, witnessed daily proof of their children's progress. Mothers spoke of tears of pride. Fathers marveled at newly written letters from their children, and siblings shared in the excitement of learning. The emotional resonance of these small victories extended beyond the classroom, creating a sense of stability and hope in neighborhoods scarred by conflict. The social implications were equally significant. In many towns, the act of returning to school helped restore routines and discipline to communities that had been fractured by war. Children were no longer left wandering the streets unsupervised. Instead, they were part of structured activities that fostered cooperation, mutual respect, and a sense of belonging. Observers noted that even among communities with lingering resentment toward occupying forces, participation in literacy programs encouraged interaction and collaboration, gradually softening divides created by ideology and distrust. From a statistical standpoint, preliminary surveys conducted by civil affairs officers underscored the magnitude of the achievement. In Hanover, for example, literacy levels among children aged 7 to 12 increased from an estimated 42% pre-program to over 75% within 6 months. Similar patterns emerged across villages in Hesse and Lower Saxony, with incremental gains in reading comprehension and handwriting observed in each monitored classroom. While these numbers did not capture every child affected, they represented a significant shift in a population that had been denied formal education for years. The psychological impact on children was equally notable. Teachers and soldiers reported increased confidence, improved attention spans, and heightened engagement in daily activities. Some children began teaching younger siblings or peers, extending the reach of education beyond formal instruction. Emotional recovery paralleled cognitive gains. Laughter returned to classrooms. Expressions of pride became frequent, and the silent despair that had characterized post-war childhood slowly gave way to cautious optimism. These outcomes were reinforced by local volunteer participation. As literacy programs expanded, former educators, community leaders, and older students contributed to the instruction process. Their involvement strengthened the sustainability of programs and ensured that knowledge transfer continued even as military personnel rotated or redeployed. The collaborative model created a sense of ownership within communities, signaling that education was not a temporary intervention, but a lasting commitment to rebuilding society. Importantly, the literacy initiatives also influenced the perception of Allied forces. Soldiers who had begun their assignments with purely operational objectives found themselves witnesses to profound human transformation. The successes of children's classrooms, the tearful celebrations of first sentences read aloud, and the communal pride in regained literacy fostered mutual respect and shifted local attitudes toward cooperation. In many towns, previously skeptical or hostile parents and community members became advocates for educational participation, reinforcing the legitimacy of the Allied presence through constructive engagement rather than coercion. The first phase of Aftermath demonstrated that literacy programs were more than educational exercises. They were catalysts for psychological recovery, social stabilization, and community cohesion. The children's tears, once symbols of loss and fear, had become markers of achievement and hope. The classrooms that had once been makeshift and fragile were now centers of learning, symbols of resilience, and testimony to the human capacity for recovery in the face of devastation. This foundation set the stage for the next phase, examining the long-term implications of these programs, both for individuals and for post-war Germany as a whole. The initial successes were only the beginning, pointing toward broader societal shifts, educational reforms, and the enduring legacy of a generation whose lives had been irreversibly shaped by conflict, yet restored through the transformative power of literacy. As 1947 unfolded, the post-war literacy programs began to leave enduring marks on both individual lives and broader German society. Children who had once wandered the streets of ruined towns now carried notebooks and pencils, symbols of personal achievement and societal reintegration. Their ability to read and write opened doors that had been closed for years, allowing them to participate in civic life, communicate with family members, and envision futures beyond mere survival. Literacy became a conduit for empowerment, granting children a voice in a world previously defined by chaos and deprivation. On a community level, these programs fostered cohesion and resilience. Villages where classrooms had been established reported increased participation in local governance and communal decision-making. Parents, now more invested in their children's education, collaborated with instructors to maintain schedules and share resources. Formerly abandoned schoolhouses became hubs of social activity, where knowledge, hope, and cooperation intersected. The lessons extended beyond reading and writing. They taught routines, discipline, and the value of persistence, reshaping communities that had been fractured by war. Statistical records from Allied occupation authorities further underscore the program's significance. Surveys conducted in multiple towns revealed that literacy rates among children aged 7 to 14 had improved by an average of 30 to 35% within the first year. Older students who had missed years of schooling demonstrated significant gains in arithmetic, comprehension, and written communication. These figures, though not exhaustive, reflected a substantial societal shift. A population previously deprived of education was regaining the foundational skills necessary for long-term stability and civic engagement. The programs also influenced post-war educational policy in Germany. Allied authorities encouraged the establishment of formal curricula that combined fundamental literacy with practical knowledge, including hygiene, nutrition, and basic civic responsibilities. Pre-war textbooks laced with Nazi propaganda were replaced with neutral or Allied-approved materials, laying the groundwork for a reformed and ideologically neutral education system. Local educators, trained alongside soldiers, ensured continuity, gradually assuming responsibility for sustaining instruction as military personnel transitioned to advisory roles. Individual stories illustrate the profound impact of these initiatives. In a small town near Kassel, a girl named Ingrid, who had lost her parents during the final months of the war, began attending lessons in a makeshift classroom. Initially silent and fearful, she quickly absorbed the basics of reading and writing. Within months, she was helping younger children learn letters and words, demonstrating a remarkable transformation in both confidence and agency. Ingrid's story was echoed in countless villages. Children who had been passive witnesses to devastation became active participants in rebuilding both their own lives and their communities. The moral and emotional resonance of these programs cannot be overstated. The children's tears, once expressions of fear, hunger, or loss, transformed into tears of pride, joy, and accomplishment. Soldiers and educators observed that reading and writing restored more than academic skills. It restored a sense of normalcy, hope, and dignity. Communities recognized that education was not merely a technical task, but a moral imperative, a pathway toward reconciliation and renewal. By the late 1940s, the broader implications of literacy programs were evident. German society began to stabilize in measurable ways. Children who had participated in these early efforts were better equipped to adapt to formal schooling, pursue vocational training, and engage in civil society. The programs demonstrated that systematic, empathetic, and persistent educational initiatives could accelerate recovery after total war, reinforcing both psychological resilience and social cohesion. These outcomes set the stage for the final reflection, a calm, philosophical consideration of what these efforts meant for Germany, for post-war humanity, and for the enduring power of education as a tool for healing and reconstruction. The classrooms, once fragile and temporary, have become enduring symbols of recovery. Proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, human resilience and the capacity to learn could triumph. The story of German children learning to read again in the aftermath of war is, at its core, a story of human resilience. In classrooms built from rubble, with pencils sharpened on scraps of paper and desks improvised from crates, hope took tangible form. Literacy was not merely a skill. It was a reclaiming of agency, a quiet defiance against the chaos that had consumed lives, cities, and communities. Each child who traced letters on paper was, in essence, tracing a path back to normalcy, dignity, and possibility. Education in this context transcended academic instruction. It was a vehicle for psychological healing, restoring confidence and a sense of stability to children who had grown up in the shadow of fear and deprivation. Soldiers and teachers alike witnessed the transformative power of patience, persistence, and human connection. The tears that accompanied first words read aloud were both personal and symbolic, representing a profound intersection of loss, recovery, and hope. The broader significance extends beyond individual classrooms. These early literacy programs demonstrated that education could serve as a cornerstone for societal reconstruction. By restoring basic skills and fostering curiosity, communities were rebuilt from the inside out. Trust was nurtured between former enemies, and ordinary acts of instruction became catalysts for reconciliation, cooperation, and renewed social cohesion. The lessons of these efforts about perseverance, empathy, and the enduring impact of knowledge resonate far beyond post-war Germany. Ultimately, the story of these children offers a universal truth. Even after total devastation, the human spirit can endure, and the simplest acts of teaching can ignite profound change. A pencil, a book, and a patient guide are more than tools. They are instruments of hope. In the classrooms of shattered towns, amid ruins and frost, a generation discovered that learning could heal, empower, and transform. And in those quiet moments, the future began again.